Now we are going to start our first sessions. It is on introductions to cryptocurrency. Professor Ashish Chaudhary is going to deliver this talk. And let me introduce Professor Ashish Chaudhary. He received his MS Research and PhD degree from Indian Institute of Technology Madras in 2006 and 2010 respectively. After his PhD, he worked as a visiting scientist at Indian Statistical Institute, Calcutta for a year and then research assistant for 2 years at University of Bristol. His research interests include theoretical cryptography with specialization in cryptographic protocols and primitives. He has published more than 15 journals, 50 conferences and workshop papers, 30 publications and 1 book to his credential. I request to Professor Ashish Chaudhary to start his talk.
Okay. So, thank you for the introduction. Before I proceed, a few disclaimers from my side. I'm not an expert in cryptocurrencies and blockchain. My interest in cryptocurrency actually was there the last 3-4 years, specifically in the context of the consensus protocols which are used in blockchain. So if you have questions regarding specific technical aspects of cryptocurrencies, blockchain, I think the later speakers in this FTP will be more suitable to answer your queries. So this will be a kind of a tutorial talk, and feel free to stop me if something is not clear. Unfortunately, I won't be able to see the chat windows if you are typing your questions in the chat window. So I would request someone to stop me and read out questions if something significant is there. So the tutorial is divided into several parts, but roughly the main goal of the tutorial is to answer some of the questions like what are the cryptographic primitives used in Bitcoin, because I will be talking specifically about Bitcoins. How does the Bitcoin work? We will see a rough idea and a very high level overview how exactly various primitives are stitched together to make Bitcoin work. And we will try to get an overview regarding how secure is the Bitcoin protocol. The references for this tutorial are the following. So I will be broadly using this textbook. This is a very nice textbook, and it used to be freely available online a few years back. I don't know the current status. And this is an excellent book, and the same set of people, the authors of this textbook, have also offered a course which is available on the Coursera. And of course, because Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is such a popular topic, there are lots of online references which are also available. Right. So since Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency, we have to first understand what exactly is a currency. So if we consider physical currency, which is also called as fiat currency, namely the rupee currency that we have, or you take currency of any country, then this physical currency has some features which are satisfied. The first property is the anonymity property, which means that the spender's identity remains private. So if, for instance, if you have a 500 rupee note and you go to a shop to buy something, purchase something, and you give that 500 rupee note, no one will ask you that please give your Aadhaar card details. I would like to link your Aadhaar card with this 500 rupee note. So in that sense, your identity remains private. Okay, so that's what we mean by the anonymity property of a physical currency. And since it is anonymous, due to that, it is untraceable as well. That means it is not impossible, but rather I would say it is difficult to trace the entire origin of a currency. So for instance, if you take out your wallet and if you have say 100 rupee note in your wallet, and if I ask you that, can you find out that what exactly is the entire history of that 100 rupee note that you have? That means starting from when it got printed and when it was first given to some customer, and that first customer gave it to second customer, and all the way it came to you. If I asked to trace that entire history, then it will be quite difficult. I'm not saying it is impossible. If someone wants, if government, for instance, want, they can try to enforce some mechanisms which can ensure traceability, but we don't do that. So in that sense, it is untraceable. And a very important property of any physical currency is that you cannot double spend it, in the sense that you cannot create carbon copies or photocopies of a 100 rupee note that is available with you and spend the same 100 rupee at multiple places. Of course, you can try to forge RBI director's signature and try to print forged currency, but that will be quite difficult. So in that sense, physical currency also supports no double spending. And finally, we have well-known trusted organizations. I would rather say centralized organizations like RBI, World Bank, and so on. So every country has its own centralized organizations, central banks, which control the entire money supply and adding anti-counterfeiting features in the currency, right? So these are some of the properties of fiat currency or physical currency. Now, what we are aiming here is to get a digital version of physical currency. Okay, and we call them as cryptocurrency. It will be clear soon why exactly we call it cryptocurrency. And analogous to physical currency, here also we would like anonymity property to be achieved, untraceability property to be achieved, no double spending to be supported in your digital currency. And we would also like to get rid of this assumption. So in the physical currency, we had this assumption that you have well-defined centralized organizations who are actually formulating the entire rules of your currency. But when we are aiming to design a cryptocurrency or digital currency, we want to be more democratic. We do not want to involve any centralized agency whatsoever. So we would like to get rid of this fourth assumption. But now you can see that as soon as I remove this requirement, that I am aiming for a system where there should not be any centralized agency. Each participant of the system should be able to control the entire currency in an equal fashion. Then, in the absence of any centralized agency, I get two conflicting requirements. I want the anonymity property to be achieved. That means there is no centralized agency. And in the absence of the centralized agency, I would like to achieve the anonymity property, namely the spender's identity should be private. But at the same time, I would like to achieve no double spending, right? So when we are designing a digital currency, everything will be a binary string. A currency will be nothing but a bit string. And unlike physical currency, it is very simple to create multiple copies of a bit string. You just have to do Control-C and Control-V. So if you have, say, a currency and say your currency is represented by this binary string, say, who prevents you from creating multiple copies of this binary string and spending it at multiple locations and where there is no centralized agency to track that whether multiple copies of this digital currency is getting spent at multiple locations or not. So that's why as soon as I say that I do not want any centralized agency, then it will look like that achieving both these properties together. That means support for no double spending as well as the support for anonymity looks like a pair of conflicting requirements. But in 2008, a person called Satoshi Nakamoto, we don't know exactly the identity of the person, but I have kept here a cartoon for Japanese character because Nakamoto is believed to be a Japanese character. So he published not published, he actually made available this paper in the public domain, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And it achieves very nice properties. So first of all, it is completely decentralized. That means you do not have anything like World Bank or Reserve Bank of India and so on. It's completely decentralized, and it supports user to user as well as user to merchant transactions. What does that mean? It means that there is no distinction between a user and a merchant in his system. And this is unlike your physical currency, where in physical currency, people like you and me are users, whereas entities like Amazon, PayPal, or any company or any online merchant with whom you are doing the transaction, it's a merchant. It is treated as a different entity, right? So a transaction between a user and a merchant happens typically, and user and merchant are two different entities in physical currency. Right. So I was saying about this paper published in 2008, which proposed this system called Bitcoin. And it has very nice features like it is completely decentralized. It does not make any distinction between user and merchant. And since it is completely decentralized, you might be wondering that who exactly is minting coins in the system, because or is printing new currency. So the users of the system itself are given complete control to mint coins or notes or currency or whatever you call. And the process will be analogous to minting currency in the physical currency system. So in the physical currency system, there are some well-known rules according to which the regulatory authorities like RBI or any other regulatory authority can print currency. The same, according to same rules, we give the users of the system control to mint coins. The downside is, even though it provides a good level of anonymity, it is not completely anonymous, in the sense that if someone really wants to put a lot of resource and effort and computational power, then by tracking various transactions which has happened in the system, one can find out or link the activities of the users. So in that sense, it is not completely anonymous, but from the viewpoint of a this normal user like you and me, it provides good level of anonymity, right? So after this article was published, for a couple of years, not much attention was paid to this article, but then suddenly people started realizing the value of this system, and this whole system started getting a lot of attention, attraction worldwide. And that's why there was suddenly a huge boom in the value of Bitcoins, right? So this is again a very old slide. This is 2017. I don't know what exactly is the current value of a Bitcoin, but in 2017, the value went all the way to $2,500 per Bitcoin. And after this Bitcoin boom, there were lots of other players which also came in the market with varieties of cryptocurrencies, which provides better features, better trade-off compared to Bitcoin and so on. So now I would like to answer that why exactly this Bitcoin is called as a cryptocurrency. It is called cryptocurrency because it involves cryptography. And now people who do not know what exactly is the cryptography. So cryptography is on a very high level. It's a mathematical science. It's a mathematical science primarily dealing with the problem of secure communication. What exactly secure communication mean? So imagine we have a sender, we have a receiver. They are separated and connected over an internet or by a channel. And sender has some message M, which it wants to communicate in a private fashion to the receiver by sending it over the channel. So if sender sends message directly over the channel, and if there is a third party who observes the communication, then it will also learn the message M. So cryptography primarily dealt with this problem. So the goal of cryptography is to basically come up with algorithms, which we call as encryption and decryption algorithms, which allows the sender to send this message in a private fashion to the receiver. You can imagine that cryptography provides you algorithm according to which sender can put the message inside the envelope, and that envelope will be communicated over this channel. And a third party who looks into the envelope cannot figure out what exactly are the contents inside the envelope. Only receiver will have the mechanism to open this envelope and find out what exactly are the contents of the message. Right? Typically, that was the goal of cryptography. But now, cryptography is used to solve plenty of other problems. You can imagine that wherever we have a scenario where we do not want our data to be used by an unauthorized person, it should not be made available to an unauthorized person, cryptography comes into picture. So since we are aiming for a form of digital currency where there is no centralized agency, and we do not want a bad guy to cause harm in the system, we will be using cryptographic tools. And that's why the currency that we are aiming to design here will be called as a cryptocurrency. So there are lots of cryptographic tools, primitives, apart from encryption and decryption, which are used for various purposes for solving various real world problems. In the context of cryptocurrencies, the two key primitives, two key cryptographic tools or primitives which are used extensively are cryptographic hash functions and digital signatures. They are the ones which are primarily used in Bitcoin. And we will be discussing about cryptographic hash functions and digital signatures in this tutorial. But there are several other advanced cryptographic tools used in the proposed extensions of Bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies which were developed after Bitcoin. And some of them are like zero knowledge proofs, threshold cryptography, and so on. But these are very advanced in nature, and due to interest of time, I won't be discussing the zero knowledge proofs and threshold cryptography in this tutorial. We will be discussing only about cryptographic hash functions and digital signatures. So let's start with cryptographic hash functions. So what is a hash function? I'm sure people who are familiar with data structure, they might have encountered hash functions, but the hash functions which we use in the context of data structures, they are very different from cryptographic hash functions. So first of all, what is a hash function? It is a many-to-one function. So it takes input any binary string and produces an output which is always of fixed length. So input can be of any length. It could be as small as a single bit. It could be as large as 1 terabyte of data. So that's why this circle here, it denotes the set of inputs. And as I said, the input could be anything. It could be any binary string. So that's why I denote this set as 0, 1, and in the superscript, you have star. So this set 0, 1 superscript star denotes a set of all possible binary strings. Okay. And this hash function we denote by this notation H. Now, what this hash function produces as output, it produces output an n-bit string. So if you give an input, say x, it gives you h of x as the output, and h of x will be always an n-bit output. Okay, irrespective of what's the length of x. Even if x is 1 bit, h of x will be some n-bit string. Even if x is 1 terabyte of data, h of x will be output of will be a bit string of n bits. Okay, so the input could be of any length, it could be of any arbitrary length, but output is always of fixed length. Okay, that's important. Now, why it is a many-to-one function? It is a many-to-one function because there could be multiple x values. Say you could have two different inputs, x1 and x2, such that h of x1 as well as h of x2 will be same. And why this is bound to happen? Because we have outputs which are only 2 to the power n numbers. So how many distinct outputs you can obtain? You can obtain 2 to the power n number of distinct outputs because the output is always an n-bit output. So either you could have an output which is an n-bit string consisting of all zeros. You could have an output which is an n-bit string consisting of 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, and so on. You could have an output which is an n-bit string consisting of all ones and so on. So how many such distinct outputs you can have? You can have 2 to the power n distinct outputs. But how many inputs are possible? Inputs are infinite in number because the input strings of this function h do not have any restriction on its length. So that's why there is a principle, a very simple principle in discrete mathematics, which is called as pigeonhole principle. But I do not have time here to explain what are pigeons here and what are holes here. Basically, you can imagine pigeons here are nothing but all possible inputs of this h function, and holes are basically the possible outputs. And each pigeon will go and occupy one hole. So since the number of pigeons, namely the number of inputs here, are more than the number of holes, of course, there will be a pair of inputs x1, x2, not one. There could be multiple pairs of x values, right? Where those input pairs are not same, but h of x1 is equal to h of x2. So that's why this function will be a many-to-one function. Okay, so that's a simple definition of a hash function. Now, we need some properties from this hash function. Okay, even though the description is so simple, right? You might be wondering what's the big deal in designing such a function which takes any bit string of any length and produces an output of n bit. What's the big deal in designing such a function? Well, indeed, there is a big deal in designing such a function because we need some properties to be satisfied by my hash function h. So what are the security properties I require from my function h? I need collision resistance property. I will be explaining this very soon. I need one-wayness property from my hash function. Again, I will explain this. And in the context of cryptocurrencies, we need a third property, which we call as puzzle friendliness. Only when all these three properties are satisfied by your function h, I will call it a cryptographic hash function. If any of these three properties is missing, my function won't be called as a cryptographic hash function. Okay, so now let's see what exactly this collision resistance, one-wayness, and puzzle friendliness property means. So let's start with the collision resistance property. I will say that a function h, which maps arbitrary length bit strings to fixed length output, is collision resistant if it is infeasible. Let me write down this infeasible in quote unquote, impractical. To find a pair of bit strings x, y of any length. The length of x could be anything, the length of y could be anything. The only requirement is that x should be different from y and hash of x and hash of y are same. So if it is infeasible or impractical to find out a pair of distinct inputs x, y, which gives you the same hash value. So pictorially, what I'm saying is, you should not be able to find out a value x, a value y, which are different, but their hash values are same in practical amount of time or in a small amount of time. If that is the case, then I will say that my function H is collision resistant. But if in practical amount of time you are able to find out a pair of inputs X and Y which are different but their hash value being same, then I will say that my H function is not collision resistant, right? So I stress here that I am saying here that it should be impractical or it should be infeasible. I am not saying it is impossible. There is a difference between the terms impossible and impractical. This is because I can always find a collision in my function H because of the pigeonhole principle. So here in this example, I am considering the case where n is equal to 256. That means the output of the hash function is a 256-bit string. If that is the case, then it is always possible to find out a collision. What I have to do? I have to take these many number of distinct X values or input values, evaluate the or compute the hash values of these inputs. So let me call the inputs as X1, X2, X3, X4, and all the way input number 2 to the power 256 plus 1. The hash of X1 will be some value Y1, hash of X2 will be some value Y2, hash of X3 will be some value Y3, and so on. And hash of the 2 to the power 256 plus 1 input will be some Y value. My claim is that among these Y values, there will be definitely one Y value which will be same. Okay, that means there will be some pair of X values, say X1 and X4, such that the corresponding hash values are always same, because you have more number of inputs than the number of distinct outputs, right? So you can always find the collision with 100% with probability 1 if you compute the output of your hash function on these many distinct inputs. But 2 to the power 256 inputs is an enormously large quantity. Even if you pull together all the resources, computing resources in this universe, you won't be alive to see the outputs of these many, to see the output of the hash function on these many inputs. So even though this algorithm will always give you collision, it is impractical, right? So that's why I'm saying I'm not putting a restriction here that it should be impossible to find a collision. My requirement in the collision resistance property is it should be infeasible to find out a pair of distinct inputs with the same hash output. Okay. There's a slight tweak to this trivial collision finding algorithms. So if I evaluate the hash function on these many inputs, definitely I will get a collision with 100% success probability. But there is a very nice principle in probability theory, which we also call as birthday paradox, which you can Google it because I won't be discussing that, which says that if the output of the hash function consists of 256-bit length strings, then you don't need to evaluate the hash function on 2 to the power 256 plus 1 distinct inputs. Even if you evaluate your hash function on 2 to the power 130 plus 1 number of random inputs, there is a very good chance that you will get a collision. Okay, that means I have simply reduced the number of hash computations which I need to do to find out a collision. Okay, so that's why I am not saying that collision resistance means it is impossible to find a collision. Collision resistance means it should be impractical to find out a collision. And by the way, the description of the hash function will be given to you. My requirement here is that even if you know the description of the hash function, still it should not be feasible, or it should not be practical for you to deploy computing resources and find out a pair of distinct inputs which give you the same hash. If that's the case, then we will say that my hash function is collision resistant. And if you are wondering whether we have collision resistant hash functions existing in practice, we do have candidate hash functions. So we have various hash functions like SHA-1, SHA-2, SHA-3, they are considered to be candidate collision resistant hash functions. They are designed in such a complicated way that it is impractical to find out the collision. Okay. So now let's see some nice applications of collision resistance property of hash functions, and this application is indeed used in the context of cryptocurrencies. So the application here, I'm slightly deviating from the context of cryptocurrencies, but the principle which is used in this application is used left and right in any cryptocurrency. So the application here is the following. Imagine you are a client and you have a file X, which you do not want to store with you because you do not have sufficient space. Your X could be as large as, say, 100 terabyte. Okay, it could be as large as 100 terabyte of data, which you do not want to store with you because you do not have sufficient resources. But imagine there is a server, cloud server, which is available, whose service you can purchase, which says that, okay, you just pay me, I can store the file for you, and later when you want to retrieve the file, you can download it. For instance, take Dropbox, right? Most of us are now using cloud storage space like Dropbox, or if we are using Outlook, then we have OneDrive system available and so on, where we outsource or where we store our files in the cloud server, and we do not end up using our local disk space. Imagine later you want to download the file X. If you later download the file X, what is the guarantee that you have downloaded the correct file? What's the guarantee that the server has provided you the right copy of the file X? Well, you can say that I can always keep a copy of file X, and when I download, I compare the downloaded copy with the version that I have. If they match, then I am happy, otherwise I am unhappy. But then at the first place, the whole purpose of offloading the file or storing the file to the server is lost. If you can store the file with yourself, then why at the first place you bought the service of the server? So you do not have any data regarding X at your disposal. So how do you do the comparison? So the way we can solve this problem is the following. We want a mechanism where client should have some data regarding X with him, such that that data should be independent of the size of X. That is important. That data should be independent of the size of X, so that later when client downloads the copy of X from the server, he can do a comparison and come to a conclusion whether he has downloaded the right X or not. So here is the solution. When client is uploading the X, it can compute a hash of the file X. Let me call it as D of X. D of X is often called as the message digest of the file X, and H here is a hash function. And I am assuming here that my function H is collision resistant. Due to that, what can I say about the size of this D of X? Size of D of X will be independent of X. It doesn't matter whether your X was 1 GB large, whether your X was 1 TB large, whether your X was 100 TB large. Once you hash it, you will obtain a fixed 256 length bit output, which is independent of how large your data X was. And you can store the hash of the file which you have uploaded to the server with you. Later, when server gives you back the copy of the file X, how do you do the comparison? Well, you can again recompute the hash of the downloaded file and compare it with the message digest. If the match happens, you can happily accept that you have downloaded the correct copy. Otherwise, you can blame the server that you are not providing me the right copy. Now, why this system will work? The system will work because if indeed server is a bad guy, and if he is providing an incorrect file Y different from X, that means server now has to find out a collision. Namely, he has to find two files, X and Y, where X is not equal to Y, but h of x and h of y are same as d of x. If a bad server can find such a pair of files x comma y, then he can fool the client by providing an incorrect file, and client will believe that he has downloaded the correct file. But what are the chances that a server can find out a pair of files x comma y? The chances are as good as he is breaking the collision resistance property of the hash function. But I am assuming here that my hash function is collision resistant, and that's why it is infeasible for a server. Even if he is computationally enormously resourceful, it will be difficult for the server to find out such pair of files x comma y. So what is the idea in this whole application? The idea here is that the hash of a file served as an identifier for your file, in the sense that I can say that if you take a college, each student has a roll number, irrespective of the student coming from which city, which state, what are his parents' details, and so on. I can assign a unique roll number to the student, and that roll number is a very short summary of the student. In the same way, I can say that the digest of a file is serving as a unambiguous identifier or the summary of the file. And the beautiful thing here is that the summary size is completely independent of the size of your original data, right? So that's the collision resistance property. Now let's go to the one-wayness or hiding property. What exactly one-wayness means? So I will say that my hash function has one-wayness or hiding property if the following holds. If I am given an input x, right, and if I choose a random bit string r, forget about its terms mean entropy, probability distribution, and so on, because that's not required for the purpose of this tutorial. The important thing to note here is that the secret value r is a large random string, sufficiently large, say 100-bit long random string, again chosen by me. So I, as a user, have an input x, and I want to hide the value x, but at the same time, I want to give some information about x in the public domain to be available, which can be used at a later point of time. But I do not want to reveal x at the moment. I am willing to reveal x later, but at the moment, I want to give you something about x, but that something should not reveal anything about x. If I just hash the x and give it to you, then that will not serve the purpose, because my x could be a single bit as well. If x is a single bit, and if I just hash it and give you, you yourself can find out whether I have given you hash of 0 or hash of 1. So that's why what I am doing here is the following. I am taking a sufficiently long random bit string, which I am calling as r. You do not know that. And instead of giving you the hash of x, I am giving you the hash of r concatenated with x. Okay, again, forget about all this mean entropy. These are slightly advanced terms here. For the purpose of this discussion, just consider r to be sufficiently random. Okay. Now, one-wayness property means the following, that if I give you the hash output for the input r concatenated with x, then even though you know the description of the hash function, you know the output y, it should not be possible for you to come up with the value of x in practical amount of time. Okay, that means you know the length of r as well. That is also given to you. I tell you the length of r as well. I can tell you that, okay, I have chosen a 256-bit random string r and concatenated with my input x, and I have hashed it and given to you. Now the challenge for you, can you find out in feasible time the value of x, the exact value of x? One-wayness property says that it is infeasible to do that. Again, I am saying it is infeasible to do that, because you can always do a brute force over candidate value of x and candidate value of r and end up getting the exact value of x. But that will require you to come evaluate the hash function on many number of candidate R values and many number of candidate X values. So that's a one-way-ness property. One-way-ness property, why it is called one-way-ness? It is called one-way-ness because it is easy to go in the one direction, but difficult to come back in the reverse direction. So what are the two directions here? I as a user can compute X, can compute R, and I can compute Y very easily because I will be given the description of the hash function as well. That's the one direction, the easy direction. But you who are given only Y and only the description of the hash function cannot invert back and get the value of X and R. In that sense, it is easy in one direction, but difficult in the reverse direction. So if this property is satisfied by the hash function, then I will say that my hash function satisfies one-way-ness or hiding property. And indeed, the practical candidate hash function, practical candidates for hash functions that we have, like SHA-1, SHA-2, SHA-3, we believe that they have hiding and one-way-ness property. Okay. Now let's go to the third property of the hash function, which we call as the puzzle friendliness property, which is very important in the context of Bitcoins. So when do we say that my hash function is puzzle friendly? It will be called puzzle friendly if the following happens. If for every possible n-bit output value Y, I choose a random K. Okay, so K is randomly chosen here. Y is also given. Your goal is to find out an X of any length such that when you hash the concatenation of K and X, you should get the Y that I have given to you. If you are able to do that in practical amount of time, a reasonable amount of time, I will say that my hash function is not puzzle friendly, right? So the requirement is that it should not be possible for you to find out the candidate X such that when you concatenate X with your K, you get the Y that I have given to you. Okay, so pictorially what's happening here is the following. Puzzle means here the following. An instance of the puzzle is created as follows. I will give you some Y. Okay, Y could be a subset of this set 0, 1 power n, or it could be a single string as well. Okay, and I give you K as well. The thing is that K won't be known to you in advance. When an instance of the puzzle is created, K will be chosen randomly by me. Okay, it won't be known to you beforehand that what will be the random K. You will be knowing the value of Y beforehand. That is known to you. What is not known to you is the puzzle instance, and the puzzle instance is basically this random K. Now, once the puzzle starts, you will be given K. You are given the description of the hash function. You are given Y as well. Your goal is to find out at least one X such that the hash of K concatenated X is equal to Y, or it is a member of the set Y if Y is a subset. If that is the case, you have won the puzzle. But if you cannot find out X within the time frame, within the time period that I am allowing you, say for instance, I say that, okay, find out a candidate X for the XK that I have given to you, say in 1 hour. In 1 hour, you are able to find a candidate X, then you are able to solve this puzzle. In 1 hour, you are unable to find out an X, then you actually lost the puzzle. So I will say that my hash function has puzzle friendliness property if you cannot solve the puzzle within a reasonable amount of time. Again, for practical candidates of hash functions like SHA-1, SHA-2, SHA-3, we believe that it satisfies the puzzle friendliness property. So you might be wondering where exactly we use the one-wayness property, puzzle friendliness property of the hash functions in the context of cryptocurrencies. When we will go into the technical details of Bitcoin, we will see where exactly we use the puzzle friendliness property, where exactly we use the one-wayness property. Okay. Oh, by the way, I have actually an application of puzzle friendliness. So let's see how exactly a puzzle is created. So puzzle is created as follows. I already discussed this, but again, let me pictorially tell you. So you are given the description of the hash function and you are given a puzzle ID. Puzzle ID is nothing but a bit string ID. Forget about this high min entropy distribution. It means it is a long random bit string. Okay, so these are the things given to you, and the solution, as I said, will be some x such that when you compute the hash of ID puzzle ID with your solution, it should give you a member of the set Y that I have specified. So it turns out that the hardness of the puzzle here, by hardness I mean how quickly or how efficiently you can solve it. So the hardness of the puzzle here is proportional to the size of the target set Y. Okay, so remember my target set Y is also given to you during the instance of the puzzle, which will be known to you beforehand. So the hardness of the puzzle depends both on the size of the target set as well as the puzzle instance as well, namely how random is your string ID. If you are wondering that why this puzzle ID is selected randomly, why can't I select it deterministically? Deterministically in the sense, why can't I make it public beforehand, before the puzzle start? Well, if I can make it beforehand available before the puzzle start, then you can always do the following. You can pre-compute the solutions before the puzzle starts because you know the ID, you know Y as well. So before the puzzle start, you can yourself compute the hash of all possible X with IDs. And once the puzzle starts, you will be ready with the solution. So that's why, to make things interesting here, the ID is selected at the runtime and it will be selected randomly and it should be sufficiently long. Then only it will be difficult for you to solve this puzzle. Okay. Right. So let me stop here and just check. Let me check whether there are any specific questions from the audience regarding whatever I have discussed till now. Are there any questions? Okay, Rakesh Mohanty, is there any significance or specific reason? So since the output space was 2 to the power 256, birthday paradox basically says that you have to just search over half of the size of your codomain. That will give you the chance of probability, so that will give you a significant chance of finding the collision. So that's why 2 to the power 130. If my output space would have been 2 to the power 512, then as per birthday paradox, I need to hash 2 to the power 256 random inputs to get a 99% chance of finding collision. Are there any other questions? Okay. So if there are no questions, then let me continue. So now we will do some advanced things with whatever we have learned till now. So I will introduce what I call as hash pointers. And to understand hash pointers, let us brush up our knowledge regarding pointers in programming language. So I am assuming all of you must have handled pointers in C programming language. So what is a pointer? It is a special kind of a variable which contains the address of a memory location. So if I say P is a pointer variable, then it can store an address of some location, say location number 1884. That's the concept of pointer in a typical programming language. Now, what is the hash pointer? It is also a special type of pointer which points or refer to some data, some memory. It could be a memory location, but typically it is not memory location. It is basically a pointer to a block of data. But apart from pointing to that block of data, we also store the hash of the data along with the pointer itself. So I will be using this notation to denote hash pointer. So if I say this is a hash pointer, by this I mean that here we will be storing, or here we will be having some reference to a data block. That data block could be somewhere else as well. It could be in some memory or somewhere in some data structure, which we are going to define later. So a reference to this data block will be there as part of this hash pointer. And along with that, whatever is the hash of this data, this H of data, that also will be stored here. Right? This is the difference. In the typical pointers in programming language, a pointer just contains the reference to the data or the location. But here what I'm saying is, apart from the reference, we also store the hash value of the data which is stored at that location. And that hash of the value is stored as part of your hash pointer itself. Why it will be useful to store the hash of the data which you are referring to the pointer? It will be useful to verify later when you are retrieving the data, whether you have retrieved the right data or not. So what do I mean by that? Later, suppose if you want to get this data, the data which actually you were referring to through this hash pointer, how do you know whether you have got the right data or not? So again, since we have the hash of the data stored as well as part of the hash data pointer, whatever data we are retrieving later, we can verify whether it is the right data or not by recomputing the hash value and comparing it with the hash of the data that was stored earlier with us as part of the hash pointer itself. And assuming that finding collisions is difficult, impractical, it will be really very difficult for someone to change the data and pass it on to you saying that, okay, here is the data which you are referring to. Okay, because if it changes the data, then it will automatically change the hash of the data or the digest of the data, which will not match with the digest for the original data which you have stored with you. So that's the hash pointers. So now what we can do is the following. We know that using traditional pointers, we can create lots of nice data structures, right? So we can create linked list, various types of linked list, single linked list, double linked list, forward, backward, etc., etc. Let's take the standard linked list. Okay, what's the standard linked list? You have a sequence of blocks. Okay, so this is your head block. Then you have the second block. You have the third block. And then each block will have some data and the address of the next block. And the last block, since there is no block after this, it will be having a null reference. And then you will be storing the address of the head block somewhere. Okay. If someone gives you this head block, the address of the head block, then you can parse the entire linked list. That's the standard linked list. Now, what we can do is the following. We can redesign the same data structure where we have a sequence of blocks. In each block, we have data and a reference for the next block. But what I'm going to do is the following. I am going to replace the standard pointers by hash pointers. And the corresponding linked list that we obtain, where we have a sequence of blocks chained together through hash pointers, is called as a blockchain. Right? That's a very simple definition of a blockchain. It's not a gigantic creature. It's a very simple data structure. It's a single link. It is a standard linked list where you have a sequence of blocks chained together. The only difference is that the consecutive blocks, they are actually tied together through hash pointers. So to explain to you, you can imagine that if I take this, I can imagine this diary as a blockchain. This will be the head, and this will be my first data block, which will have some data. And at the end, I can write down the hash of whatever contents I have in the next page. In the next page, I can have data. And at the end, I can have a short summary of whatever is there in the third page, and so on. If I do this, create this data structure, then this data structure is called as the blockchain. Okay. Now, why this blockchain is such a nice data structure? This is a nice data structure because it helps us to create what we call as temper evident log. What is a temper evident log? Well, it is a log where you can record all the activities. It could be the activities of any application. It could be it could be the details of all the transactions, the entire log for a banking application. It could be the log of your entire university where you maintain of each and every, where you keep track of each and everything that has happened within the university, like admissions, exams, and so on. So it could be log for anything. So it is a data structure, which is a log data structure, and it should have the provision to append data to the end of the log. That means you should have the provision to populate your log. It should not be static. It should be dynamic. That means as and when new transactions are getting executed in your underlying application, in your underlying system, you should be able to append those records as well on the top of whatever you have already recorded. And it should be tamper evident in the sense that if any change happens in the log, it should be detectable. Everyone should be able to detect that something bad has happened in the log. Bad in the sense that either some entry has been manipulated, or some pages have been modified, some pages have been teared off, and so on. All these things should be detectable. My claim is that blockchain, or this linked list based on hash pointers, indeed helps you to achieve these properties. Why so? So imagine this is a imagine this is a blockchain which has the record of every activities, all the transactions which have happened in your system, in your organization. Okay. And say you have the head hash pointer available with you. You means you are a user. Okay. You need not have to store the entire blockchain with you, because that entire blockchain, it could be enormously huge in size because it has the log of your entire system. It could be of size terabytes. Okay, you need not have to store the entire blockchain. You just need to store the head hash pointer, just a basic summary, which will be either a 256-bit long string or 512-bit long string, depending upon what is the output size of your hash function. So imagine the head hash pointer is stored securely with you. If you want to insert a new data, you means say the administrator who is actually maintaining the blockchain. If they want to insert new transactions, then it will be the same operation as you would have done to insert a new data block in an existing linked list. So if we want to insert a new data block in the traditional linked list, what we do? We create a new block. Whatever data we want to write, we write here. We set the next pointer here to be null, and then we just adjust this null pointer and let it point to this block. That's what we would have done if we want to insert a new block in an existing linked list. The same operation we will be doing if we really want to insert some genuine data, right? So assume that this was the last page of my diary. Okay, so again, let me show you with this example. So say I have this diary with me, and say I have already written something here. Few blocks have been already occupied, and now I want to write something here. If I want to write something here, I will write whatever contents I want to write. I will hash it, this entire page. And the hash of this page, I would have simply inserted in the previous page. That would act as a hash pointer for the new page that I have created. That will be equivalent to inserting a new data in an existing blockchain. So that's not a difficult operation, and that satisfies one of the requirements of the temper evident log. One of the requirements was I should be able to insert data at the end, and that I can do easily. I don't have to do anything fancy. And now let me demonstrate that indeed I will be able to detect if anything bad happens in the blockchain. So suppose one of the administrator gets corrupt and it tries to manipulate one of the pages in the blockchain. He can do that. He can overwrite whatever contents were there in the blockchain in that particular page. He can modify that. If he tries to modify the data, then this entire binary string gets changed. And the hash of this modified block won't match with the hash value which is stored in the previous page. So he has to modify that as well. Now, if he modifies this hash value, then this will change this entire page. And that won't match with the hash value or the hash summary which is stored in the previous page. So he can modify that as well. Fine. That will change this whole page as well. But if he changes his whole page or whole binary string, then the hash of this modified page won't be matching with the head hash pointer which you have stored securely with you. So that what I'm trying to say is that if someone has stored the head hash pointer securely, carefully, and later if someone wants to verify whether the blockchain that has been maintained in the system is maintained properly or not, properly in the sense whether whatever has been recorded is recorded properly or someone has tampered upon it, you can verify that. How you can verify that? You can recompute the hash values all the way from the last block of your blockchain and come all the way to the head hash pointer or compare it with the head hash pointer which you have stored securely. Assuming that finding collisions is difficult for a bad guy won't be able to insert bad data, not insert bad data, he won't be able to modify the contents of already existing data in the blockchain and still go undetected. That won't happen. Okay, so that's why blockchain is a very powerful data structure. So we have seen that how we can construct linked list based on hash pointers. Let's see whether we can build a tree structure based on hash pointers. So again, we know that we can construct binary trees using traditional pointers. Now let us see whether we can build a tree data structures using hash pointers. And such trees we call as Merkle trees. After it is attributed to Ralph Merkle, who actually created or introduced this data structure. So at the leaf level, we will have the data blocks. Okay, so this is again, you have several data blocks. You can imagine that several pages are there which have to be tied together. Earlier in the blockchain, those pages were tied together through a linked list structure, but now we are trying to link all the data blocks using a tree structure. So let us see how we can do that. And we make an assumption here that the number of data blocks is some 2 power k. That means the number of data blocks here should be some power of 2. So either you have 2 data blocks or 4 data blocks or 8 data blocks, 16 data blocks, and so on. Okay. So how do we create Merkle tree here? So at the leaf level, so these are my leaves. At a leaf level, we will have the data blocks, and then I will try to go one layer up. How do I go one layer up? In one layer up, I add the hash pointers to the data which is stored at the lower level. So at the lower level, currently I have the data blocks. So when I go up, I store the hash pointer for this first data block, hash pointer for the second data block, hash pointer for the third data block, and so on. By the way, hash pointer is also a binary string. Remember, it is pointing to something and also have the hash value of that data, which is pointing to or referring to. Okay, so that's how I get the one level up. So you can see that in this particular example, at the leaf level, I had 8 data blocks. But when I go one layer up, I have 4 data blocks. I can apply this process to go one layer up. So when I go one layer up, what I will do is the following. I will treat this entire block as a binary string and compute a hash pointer to it. I will treat this entire thing as a binary string and create a hash pointer for it. So now you can see that for 4 nodes, I get 2 nodes when I go one layer up. And then I repeat this process till I obtain the root. Okay. So that's the Merkle tree. Okay. So this is a different data structure created using hash pointers than your blockchain. And again, it can serve the purpose of your temper evident log. You can do the insertion of the operation as you would have done in a typical binary tree. And you can also check whether something has been changed. That means, suppose if this tree has been created, and say you are the head of your organization, once this tree is created, you do not want to store the tree because that will be enormous amount of space, but you securely store the value of hash value stored at the root, and that you keep safely with you. Later, say after a month and so, you want to verify whether everything that has been recorded in the tree is still maintained properly or not. And suppose within this 1 month, someone has changed the contents of some of the nodes in this tree, then it will be easily detected. Say, for instance, an employee of your organization goes and changes the content of the second node here, second data block. If he does that, then he has to change this block as well because the hash values won't match. If he changes this node, then he has to change this node as well. Then he has to change this node as well. But if he changes this node, then the hash value of this node won't be matching with the root hash value, which the principal of the organization or the head of the organization has stored secure. And hence, the change will be easily detected. Okay, so our Merkle tree also serves the purpose of tamper evident log, but in the data structure is slightly different here. Another important beautiful property of Merkle tree is that it gives you a mechanism to prove something very efficiently. What do I mean by that? Suppose someone has created this Merkle tree, okay, and you have kept the root hash pointer with you. You are the client, okay. All these data blocks were owned by you, okay. So you had 8 data blocks. You do not want to store those data blocks with you. So what you did is the following. You hired a server and you want to offload storing these 8 data blocks to the server, but you want to keep a summary of the data blocks that you are offloading. So what you do is the following. As a client, you compute the Merkle tree and ignore the entire tree, but just keep the root value with yourself. This you keep with yourself, and then forget about the entire tree, entire data blocks. Now later, suppose you demand a server that gives me my 6th data block. Okay, that means you are asking for this data block from the server. The server can give you any data block. You want to verify whether it is indeed the correct 6th data block that you had asked the server to store. So server can prove to you, he can give some proof that indeed the data block that he's giving to you is the correct 6th data block. One proof could be, apart from the 6th data block, he gives you all the remaining 7 data blocks here. And then again, you rebuild the entire Merkle tree and compare the hash value of the rebuilt Merkle tree with the hash value that you have securely stored. And assuming that finding collisions is difficult, you will be able to identify whether the server has given back you the correct 6th data block or not. But that will be an inefficient method because you are just interested in the 6th data block. You are not interested in the remaining blocks, right? So as a proof, what the server can do is the following. Server can keep track of this entire tree. He has this entire tree because he has all the 8 data blocks. He can specify only the parts of this tree which are necessary for you to recompute the root, right? So if you see the structure of this tree, you do not need any of these data blocks or any of these blocks, actually, not data blocks. You do not need any portion of this. You do not need this portion to recompute the hash value of the root. If you are asking for the 6th data block, if you are asking for the 6th data block, and if you want to recompute the root, you don't need any information from this part of the tree. That is a redundant information. What is needed is the following. You need the 6th data block from the server and this node, okay, and this node and this node. That's all. Using this, you can recompute this root, and then you can verify whether the recomputed root matches with the root that you have securely stored with you. If the match happens, then you can say that, okay, this has been given correctly to me. Otherwise, you can conclude it's not given correctly to me. So now you can see that if you had n number of data blocks which was stored in the tree, and to verify whether you have retrieved a specific data block or not, you don't need to retrieve all the n data blocks. If you say, for instance, if you want to retrieve only the 6th data block, you don't need the remaining 7 data blocks. You need only, apart from this data block, you need this block, this block, this block. That's all. In general, if there are n data blocks which are stored at the leaf level, and if you want to later retrieve any one of those data blocks, then to verify whether the retrieved data block is correct or not, you need to actually get back only log of n number of blocks as a proof from the server to verify whether the retrieved thing is correct or not. Okay, you don't need all the n things because you have because the height of this tree, right? Why log n? Because the height of this tree, if I consider here, is logarithmic in the number of leaf nodes. And as a proof, I need only one node from each of the levels. That is sufficient me to verify the proof. So that's why proof of membership through Merkle trees is a very nice application, very space efficient, and that's why we use this Merkle tree based proof of membership in cryptocurrencies. Okay, so let me pause here for a moment, and are there any questions? Check whether there are any questions from the audience. Will the insertion of a yes, it's like saying the following. If I can always maintain a log which is append only. I can only append at the end because new activities are actually occurring in a consecutive ways. I do not want to overwrite something which I have already.
Sir, unmute your mic. Sir, unmute your mic. Okay. Okay.
Okay. Oh, so I was unmute. Sorry.
बस अभी हुआ है सर.
Okay. No, मैं तो लगा कि मैं पहले से.
नहीं अभी just हुआ just.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, Rakesh, we can build Huffman tree by replacing pointers using hash pointers, but we won't be getting anything out of it. The advantage of Merkle tree is the proof of membership part. Okay, whereas Huffman tree do not give you almost complete binary structure, right? Binary tree structure. Yeah, the advantage of the Merkle tree is that it is like an almost complete or almost full kind of binary tree. So that's why the height will be logarithmic in the number of nodes that we have at the leaf level. Okay. So are there any questions? Other questions? Right. So if there are no more questions, let me continue. Right. So we have discussed hash functions, all the three properties: puzzle friendliness, collision resistance, one-wayness. Intuitively, we understood some of their applications as well. Now let me discuss the second cryptographic primitive, which we use in Bitcoins and cryptocurrencies. This is digital signatures. And before going into digital signatures, let's try to understand the physical signatures, right? So all of us do sign documents. When you go to bank, if you want to give a check, you sign it, right? And what are the two properties that we need from a typical physical signatures? Two properties is that if you are indeed a genuine user, you should be able to sign your, you should be able to put down your signatures. It should not be difficult for you to sign your own, to give your own signature. That's the easy part. The difficult part is if someone has seen you signing multiple documents, then it should not be possible for that person to forge your signature, right? So basically the main purpose of signatures is that security property of a physical signature is the prevention of the forgery. It should not be possible for a bad guy to forge your signature on a legitimate document which you never signed in the past. That's a requirement from a physical signature. A digital signature is just a digital analog of our physical world signature, where everything is now digital, controlled by algorithms. So forget about this term PPT. Okay. So when I say I have a digital signature scheme, by that I mean that I have a triplet of algorithms, 3 algorithms, and they will be publicly known. That's important. In cryptography, we never assume that an algorithm is hidden. We never make that assumption. It's only the values with which the algorithms are operated which will be unknown. Okay, but the steps of the algorithms will be always publicly known. Right. Now, what are these algorithms? So let me demonstrate these 3 algorithms pictorially. The first algorithm is called as the key generation algorithm. It is a randomized algorithm. By randomized algorithm, I mean that if you invoke this algorithm again and again, with very high probability, you will be obtaining different outputs. That's roughly the vague definition of randomized algorithm. I'm not very precisely saying what exactly is randomized, but randomized means there will be some random steps as part of your algorithm. Those random steps I am pictorially denoting by this notation that you are tossing coin inside your algorithm. Tossing coin means you are generating random values, and depending upon the contents of those random values, the output of your algorithm will be determined. So there will be 2 outputs of the algorithm. Though they are called as keys. So one key will be called as the public verification key, PK. That will be a binary string, and a corresponding counterpart will be SK, which is also a binary string, and it is called as the signing key. So the key generation algorithm. So if you are the user, you want to generate your signing key and verification key, then you yourself can run this algorithm, because this algorithm is known to you, and this algorithm will output 2 keys for you. One key will be your signing key, which you keep with yourself because you only will be using it to sign the documents. And the other key will be the public key, which you can make available in the public domain, which will be used to verify signatures. Right, that's a key generation algorithm. The second algorithm is the signing algorithm. Okay, again, forget about this notation. Now, what the signing algorithm does? The signing algorithm takes some message which you want to sign, a document, any document, it could be of any length. It will take some document which you want to sign and the signing key which you have generated, and it will produce another bit string which is called as the signature for the message M. And the third algorithm will be the verification algorithm. The verification algorithm takes both the message as well as the signature. Again, in the physical world, if someone wants to verify your signature on some document, so the document will be there as well as the signature at the end. So that's why in the verification algorithm, both the message which has been signed as well as the signature, both will be available. They will be the inputs for this algorithm and also the publicly available verification key. And the output of the algorithm will be either 0 or 1. 0 means signature is invalid. 1 means signature is accepted. It's a valid signature. So that's the way these three algorithms are operated. What are the properties I need from a digital signature scheme? The first property is the correctness property, which demands that any legitimately signed document, when verified later, should produce the output 1. That means if you have signed a document M using your signature, using your signing key SK, and produce a signature sigma, and later if you verify this message comma signature pair using the corresponding publicly available verification key, the output should be 1. That means if you indeed have legitimately signed a document, it should not be the case that verification is getting failed. That should not happen. That's the correctness property. And the second property is the unforgeability property, which demands that any third party who do not know my signing key, the third party should not be able to produce a valid signature on some message which I never signed in the past. And this should hold even if that third party knows my verification key, the process by which the keys are generated, the process by which documents are signed, and so on. Right? So you can see for the third party, the only thing which is unknown is my signing key, the credentials using which I can sign the document. Everything else is publicly available for that third party. Still, it should be difficult. Okay. It should be difficult. So I am not saying it should be impossible. I am saying it should be infeasible or impractical for that third party who do not know my signing key, even if one bit of the signing key is missing for him, right? Say, for instance, my signing key is not one bit. Even if say some portion of the signing key is available to him, but a major portion of the signing key is not available to the third party, still it should not be possible for that third person to forge documents on my behalf. That's the security property I need from my digital signature. And there are plenty of candidate digital signature schemes. So we have RSA signatures. Of course, I cannot go into the details of them. We have DSA signing algorithm and so on. Okay. So in this tutorial, we will assume that we have a secure signature algorithm. And when I say secure signature algorithm, I mean this triplet of algorithm. We have a mechanism to generate keys, we have mechanisms to sign, and we have mechanism to verify the signatures. Now, an interesting aspect of signature schemes is the following. I can use signature schemes as kind of identity management. What do I mean by that? So suppose I am a user, okay, and this question mark means I do not say anything about my identity in the public domain. Okay, I am an anonymous person, but I know the steps of key generation algorithm, so I can run it in my computer. I will obtain two output, a signing key and a verification key. And suppose in the public domain, I make my public key available. That does not leak my identity, right? I can go to any anonymous public forum and just publish a binary string, PK, that, okay, this belongs to me, but I do not say anything about me, my date of birth, my name, my Aadhaar card, nothing. my identity remains anonymous. And now suppose I do several transactions. Here actions means you can imagine transactions. And each transaction is signed using my signing key. And again, all these transactions I publish in the public domain. Again, when I am signing and when I am making my signed actions available in the public domain, I am not revealing my identity. Everything is happening as a bit string. I am just sending some bit strings in the public domain signed by my signing key. And now suppose everyone verifies these actions using the corresponding verification key. And since I have signed my actions genuinely, as per the correctness property of the signing algorithm, as per the correctness property of the signature schemes, all my actions will be verified. So from the viewpoint of the public domain, the public will think of this entire scenario as the following, that there is some anonymous person whose identity we do not know, but what we know about that identity is that he is the owner of this bit string called PK, and all these actions, action 1, action 2, action 3, action n, has been performed by the owner of a bit string PK. That's all. In that sense, my anonymity is preserved, but still I am able to prove certain actions in the public domain. And that's a very crucial property of signature schemes. Where it will be useful in the context of the cryptocurrency is the following. Since we want to design a currency system, you need to have an account number, right? In the physical currency or physical banking system, you have an account number. If you want some money to be transferred to your account through a third person, you will give your account number to that third person, your IFSC code, bank address, bank details, and so on. Then that person can transfer money to you and so on. But when we want to design a cryptocurrency, we want anonymity property, right? Remember, one of the goals, central goals of the cryptocurrency was to achieve anonymity property. Whether achieving anonymity property is good or bad, that's a philosophical discussion. I do not want to go into that details. You can always say, then terrorist organizations can also use anonymity property and cause harm in the system. Attacks like ransomware and all this happened. Fine, I do not want to go into those philosophical discussion whether something is good or bad. Our goal is to achieve the anonymity property. But at the same time, we need some account number. If I do not have my account number, then how can I make my account number available in the public domain so that someone can transfer money to my account? So account number in the context of Bitcoins are known as addresses. So Bitcoin addresses are nothing but account number. And you can now see that your verification key can serve the role of your account number. Because if you make your verification key PK available in the public domain, then people will just think of it as, okay, there is some anonymous person who has this account number. We don't know anything apart from that about that person. And you can see that you can open multiple account numbers. No one would ask you, show your Aadhaar number and so on. Next time you want to open a new account number, again run this key generation algorithm. And since it is randomized, right? I have not yet answered, I have not yet specified that why we need it to be randomized. We need it to be randomized to ensure that if two different users in this universe are running the key generation algorithm, then with very high probability, their verification keys will be different. And that's why we will ensure that with very high probability, each entity of the cryptocurrency system will have distinct account number. Okay, so the public keys of the signature scheme has this wonderful property of achieving identity management. And that's why in the context of Bitcoins, we use the public key to serve as our account number. And you do not have to depend on anyone to open an account number. You want to open an account number, just run the key generation algorithm and that's it. Okay. With that, I conclude the first part of the tutorial. I will be happy to take questions for the first part. We have more or less discussed all the cryptographic primitives that we need. In the second part of the tutorial, I will give you the nuts and bolts of how exactly the Bitcoin operates. So I will be happy to take questions. What are the help? So we use standard hash algorithms like SHA-1, SHA-2, SHA-3. So they are our practical candidates for hash functions.